A report by Outright International has found that the LGBTQI people still experience encroachment on the right to be visible, assemble, and exist freely through increasingly hostile laws and anti-rights rhetoric rife across the political and media platforms. The report focused on different countries and regions, providing insights into the state of pride events and LGBTQI rights. Outright's Neela Ghoshal and Ohotuowo Ogbeche join me for more on this. A very good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Well, I mean, prejudice, harassment, even death is still rife in many countries around the world, isn't it, Neela?
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, there's at least 60 countries around the world that still criminalize consensual same-sex intimacy. And even in many of the countries that don't have criminal laws against our communities, we are constantly under attack, facing political repression, harassment, attempts to silence our freedom of expression, our freedom of assembly, attacks on our values, our morals, our communities, our families. And so Pride for us is really a time to push back against this everywhere that we are around the world and insist on the right to exist.
No less than 64 countries around the world, Ohotuowo, still criminalize consensual same-sex.
Yes, that is correct. And we found that in countries that criminalize same-sex relationships within adults, it's harder for people to exist and be free and enjoy other rights that are already guaranteed by their constitutions. So in countries like in Africa, mostly, like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and the Middle East and North Africa, people cannot exist in public spaces or even in private safely. So they have to jump through a lot of loopholes to organize visibility events, organize events to protect themselves. So our report really documents what it looks like to exist in these countries and what we can do as a collective to protect the right to exist, the right to assemble and to associate in these countries as well.
I mean, to think that, I mean, Neela, I mean, clubs, gay relations are banned in such places like Nigeria, for example. I mean, not too long ago, you could be, I mean, arrested and sentenced to whipping and the likes just for being gay.
And that's still the case under laws in northern Nigeria and in many other countries around the world. There have been people who've been sentenced to whipping in countries like Malaysia. And so there are countries like Afghanistan where the Taliban has said that it would reintroduce death by stoning for consensual same-sex conduct. So there is a huge amount of work to do around the world. And I think one of the most important things about Pride is not just about the LGBTIQ community itself, but about our allies standing up for us and saying that they will not tolerate violence and discrimination against us. It's a time where anyone in the world can get involved and say, I stand up for the equality and humanity of my queer siblings.
That's true what you say, what Neela says, Ohotuowo, because I mean, I think of a country like ours, South Africa, even with a constitution that's being hailed as progressive and so on, you have civil society organizations, NGOs recording or documenting a lot of neglect, a lot of harassment, humiliation of the LGBTQI community when, for example, they visit, public hospitals.
Yes, exactly that. There's a lot of hate crime against LGBT people in South Africa, and look at this in our report as well. We discussed how communities in townships are seeking to educate people on how to accept and tolerate, how to accept LGBTIQ people's rights and to reduce these hate crimes and exclusion in society. So we talked with people in South Africa that organize pride events in localities in townships, and also with refugees that are from Zimbabwe and Zambia and in South Africa trying to exist freely too. So the report also looks at what society can do, and in South Africa, for instance, what the Home Office can do to make space for queer people, whether they are South Africans or not, and how much education that needs to go on in South Africa to ensure that people in their localities, in the poorest communities, will not experience hate crime, no matter where they are from and no matter what they look like as they are in South Africa.
What sort of things have jurisdictions, Neela, that have done better than others? What have they put in place? What have they done to, help improve the situation?
I think the first and most crucial point is that countries need to decriminalize consensual same-sex conduct in order to move forward in recognizing the whole array of rights for LGBTIQ people. And luckily, on this front, we have seen a lot of progress in the last few years, with most recently the island of Dominica in the Caribbean decriminalizing, and also last October, Mauritius becoming the most recent African country to decriminalize same-sex conduct. And we were really excited in our Pride Around the World report this year to be able to report on Pride in Mauritius, because Mauritius is one of those countries that has been holding Pride for quite some time. There are other countries in Southern Africa, like Namibia, that do criminalize same-sex conduct, but where people also still go out in the streets and claim Pride and claim their right to exist. So for our colleagues in Mauritius this year, this was the first time that they could go out and do this being recognized as fully fledged members of their society. And so that was hugely important for our colleagues there. Elsewhere in the world, activists are pushing for things like comprehensive non-discrimination legislation that recognizes that nobody can be discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or sex characteristics. And our colleagues are also pushing for things like legal gender recognition around the world so that trans people can be identified in the gender with which they identify. And so, again, Pride becomes an opportunity to push governments on these commitments. Belize is one of the countries in which activists have been pushing for a comprehensive non-discrimination law. They haven't been successful yet in getting it through, but Pride Month is a time where they engage with their own government, with diplomats, and with other supporters and stakeholders to try to build alliances and coalitions that can make progress on some of these non-discrimination commitments that governments can make.
Let's just say, governments do indeed do that, but also including friends and everybody. But you still have sections of society that simply would not accept. Not too long ago, in the context of our election here, which took place about a week ago, you had religious leaders who were unashamed of their views and opinions, who believe that this is, the LGBTQI community can do their things, but outside of the purview of the public. In other words, do your thing in private. You can give us your vote, that's fine, but we don't have to see what you're doing.
Yes, they've always been people like that. And we found that pride is a way of being in society and trying to transform perspectives. Our colleagues and movements in places like Italy and Brazil, they've shown how they transform societal perspective just by living freely and by being in the public space. So it's hard to push back against anything like that when there's no law protecting you. So it has to come from the law first. When the law protects LGBTIQ people, then it can be free in society and then transform societal perspectives. Colleagues have done that in places like Croatia even, and it's a gradual process, but we see year after year society being transformed. In a place like Mauritius, for instance, when they faced pushback by some religious sects, it was also a religious sect, Catholic groups, that stood up for them and said, this is not right. You have to protect people's right to be in the public space, to demonstrate and exercise their rights at every member of society. So it's a gradual process, but activists are putting the work in to ensure that their lives, their movement, they are pushing back against societal cruel laws or cruel policies is seen by the public, and then we can transform societal perspectives as well.
And Neela, the parades, which often take place more often during Pride Month. Those parades, those performances do help. Indeed, with changing people's attitudes or increasing awareness, don't they?
They really do help. And Ohotu mentioned that we heard this from our colleagues in Mauritius, that Pride events were helping to change attitudes. We've heard this from the people that we interviewed in Italy, in Argentina, in so many countries around the world. Last year, we reported on Peru, how Pride has just exploded all over Peru into small towns and cities, where one of the things that we try to document in this report is in how many countries not only does Pride take place, but does it also take place outside the capital city? Because the more you see Pride events spreading outside the capital city, the more the general public begins to recognize that LGBTIQ people are part of the fabric of the nation, that they exist everywhere, that we're not, some kind of people who've been imported from elsewhere and just sit within, the capital or within urban centers, that we exist everywhere. That's one of the things that we and the movements that we as Outright support around the world really hope to do with Pride, to just build this basic acceptance that LGBTIQ people exist. And I just want to make one mention of intersex people, particularly. Sometimes even within our own communities, we tend to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity, and we tend not to visibilize our intersex siblings. Pride has been an opportunity for intersex people to stand up and say, we also exist. It's crucial for governments and for LGBTQ communities to recognize intersex people's existence, and to also work for laws and policies that benefit intersex communities. And so I'm not sure how widely spread this is in South Africa, but in some prides around the world, particularly in Latin America and in Asia, we've begun to see the intersex inclusive flag that includes the yellow and purple circle along the other pride colors. And our report documented intersex people speaking out in Venezuela, in Brazil, in other Latin American countries, and really making themselves part of Pride and using that to say, we're here too.
But Pride Month, of course, Ohotuowo, is also a time to celebrate some of the victories we've seen over the years.
Yes, those really hard-won victories are a time for people to celebrate and just look back at the progress they've made during Pride Month. Like Linda said, in Mauritius last year, Pride October was a time to sit back and think, this is how far we've come, even though we still have far to go, right? And places like Argentina, where they're still battling with a government that has just came into power, it's also time to look at, we've come this far with so many rights, but how much further can we go with what is happening in our democracy right now? So people take Pride Month in Florida, for instance, in the US, where there's pushback against LGBTIQ people. Activists in Florida have been contesting heavily in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and pushing back against the bills. So during Pride last year, they could create a space to exist, and that existence will celebrate that we're here, we're still present despite all these laws. And so we see that all over the world, where LGBTI communities want to take a step back and say, we couldn't do this 20 years ago, but now we can, and we will continue to work towards creating society that is accepting of everybody. And so Pride is a reminder that there's so much progress that has been made, hard-won progress, hard-won wins, and we should celebrate that during Pride Month and every time of the year.
Would you say, Neela, that, relatively speaking, the world has come a long way from where it was back in the day when Pride Month started?
I would absolutely say that. When you think about Pride starting in 1969, I don't have the figure at the forefront of my mind, but I'm sure there were dozens more countries that criminalized same-sex conduct at that time. I know that my country, the United States, and also the country of my ancestors, India, criminalized same-sex conduct up until, just the last 2 decades. And so the progress made in the last, if we take what I think of as a long scope when it comes to LGBTIQ issues, which is 40, 50, 60 years, the progress is incredible. But we don't even have to look back to the times of Stonewall to see progress. We can see that in the last 10 years, more than a dozen countries have decriminalized same-sex conduct. 20 years ago, we had no country in the world that recognized trans people legally, that would allow trans people to change their gender marker based on self-determination. And now we have about 20 countries that allow that. We didn't have any countries 20 years ago that prohibited medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex children, that attempted to force them into a sex binary by violating their bodies. And now we're getting close to, 7, 8, 9 countries that are putting in place laws that protect intersex children. So as Ohotu said, in some cases it's little by little. It can be slow progress. Sometimes the progress comes quickly. We're at a moment right now of tremendous backlash, and I think that causes some people to forget all the gains that have been made over the last decades. But the pushback that we are getting is because we've come so far, because we are so much more visible, and because we are so visible in all our diversity, with our trans siblings being front and center in many of our struggles. This is creating a lot of pushback from people who are really attached to patriarchy and rigid definitions of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. And so again, Pride Month can be a time where we can say to our allies, please get on board with us. We all benefit from a world in which these boundaries, these barriers around who we're allowed to be based on our sexuality or our gender are broken down. So let's all continue to do that together, building on the progress that already has been made.
Indeed. Please teach tolerance, education in Pride history and code so that we can continue to move forward in equality. Outrights Neela Ghoshal and Ohotuowo Ogbeche joining me, of course, for that conversation during this Pride Month.